Hello board game brothers and sisters, I'm Adam Singer and welcome to another episode where I'll be letting you know of all the board games launching on Kickstarter and Gamefound over the next week. If you're new here, we do this every single week going over all the upcoming campaigns, so if you want to stay up to date, this is the place to be. But before I get started, I do like to go over some news and announcements that I just found out about. And the first one here is that we do have a launch date for the game Rayman the board game. This one's going to be launching on September 17th. And I did give a little bit of details onto this game previously, but it is going to be a racing game. There wasn't much more info than that when this was originally announced, but since then they have put more on their campaign page, including a overview of the game from the designer. So if you are interested in the franchise and you do want to learn more, I will be covering this in more details during the week of its launch, but you can also go ahead and check out that video for yourself. Other than that, I did want to give a quick mention to a new announcement, and this one's going to be launching on October 20th. But this one is called God's Heist, and the reason that I'm mentioning this one is because this is coming from the same creators that created Assassin's Creed Brotherhood of Venice, as well as V Sabotage, and these two games do work on a similar system. It originally started with V Sabotage, but then they streamlined the system and iterated it to create Assassin's Creed. And I'm not 100% sure if this is going to be further iteration on that system, but it looks like it will be. So if you are a fan of those games and they have been very highly reviewed, this is definitely one you'll want to check out, and you can go ahead and follow along with it on Gamefound now. I also did miss a particular game last week that I did want to give a quick mention to, and this one is Everdell Duo, which is a two-player game in the Everdell universe. And the reason that I want to mention this one is just because Everdell is a really popular game, and I don't know how this one snuck under my radar, but it did. But like I said, this is a two-player game, but it's also a worker placement tableau builder because you're going to be using your workers to take various actions, whether those are to collect new cards or to gather resources in order to pay for those cards. You're going to be building up a hand of cards, but then you're also going to have cards from the main board that you are able to play, but you're only able to play those if the sun or moon token is adjacent to them, and there's going to be various actions that players will be taking that'll be moving those down the board. The game does offer both a competitive mode and a cooperative mode, and for the cooperative mode there is also a series of scenarios that you'll be able to play through that are going to be creating an overarching campaign. If you do want to learn more about this one, they got a bunch of additional information and videos on the campaign that'll tell you everything that you need to know about the game. And there is still 14 days to go on this one, which gives you some time to decide if this is one that you do want to back. And if you are looking for any of their previous content, it looks like that will all be available on their campaign as well, including the brand new oversized cards for Everdell. So if you do already own Everdell and you want to get bigger cards, that is an optional buy here. If you like this sort of content, definitely go ahead and check out BoardGameCo because Alex and I do work together keeping track of all these upcoming campaigns, and he posts a video at the end of each month letting you know of the heavy hitters for that month and giving you a bit of a peek into the future. And we are getting near the end of August here, which means that he's going to have his video up for September really soon. And you can find a link to his channel in the description down below, and if you do like his content, feel free to give him a subscribe. But if you're also interested in historical war games, this is an area that Alex and I don't cover in nearly as much detail as Zilla Blitz. He keeps tabs on a bunch of other crowdfunding platforms as well that are dedicated to these style of games. So if you are interested in those, I'll have a link to his channel down below. Definitely check him out and give him a subscribe if you do like his content. But that's everything I got for an intro. We do got quite a few interesting games launching this week, so let's check them out. And the first campaign we have launches on September 1st, and this one's called Soluna Explorers. And this one is a game that can be played either solo or cooperatively, but it's a simple game that just uses a deck of cards in order to play. And the way that you're going to set this up is take that deck of cards and then deal them into a 5x5 grid. Each of these cards can have different loot or items on them, but most of them will require you to draw a certain amount of cards from the enemy deck, which you then will have to fight. The game plays over a series of turns where the active player is going to be spending gold in order to move your pawn onto a adjacent location, and the pawn just represents all the player's party, so when a single player is moving that pawn, it is moving it for everyone. When you do find yourself fighting the various enemies in the game, you're going to be rolling dice in order to attack, but then you can also use those loot cards that you discovered for some additional advantages. Defeating enemies also gains you additional loot and gold, and the game is won by getting to the final card and then defeating the final boss there. Of course, the more loot that you have at your disposal at that time will give you a better shot at that. If you are interested in this one, you can go ahead and check it out, and I'll have it linked in the description down below. And launching on September 2nd, we have The Way, and this one is a competitive game where players are each going to have 10 different tiles matching their color out on the main board at the beginning of the game. And the goal of the game is to be the first player to collect all of your tiles. What's really interesting about all this is that players are going to be drafting cards and playing them in order to move their pawn around on that board and collect those various tiles. And the way that this works is that there's going to be a bunch of cards at the bottom of the board here, and they're all going to be in stacks of 2. And then players are just going to be taking turns drafting one of those stacks of cards, putting one of the cards in front of them, and then one of the cards at the top of the board. The important thing to note here is that these cards do come in various colors, but the only 2 colors that really matter for that round are the 2 colors that are going to be outlined on this round card on the side of the board. If the card that you put in front of you matches one of those 2 colors, and then that same color has the highest sum of numbers out at the top of the board at the end of the round, then you're going to be gaining the amount of movement points equal to those cards. Of course, since all the players are contributing cards to that top row, you're going to have to anticipate what you think the other players are going to do. But the nice thing here is that even if you end up with cards that don't seem all that useful on the surface, each of those hexes that you were able to collect so far do have a special ability associated with them. And you'll be able to spend those to activate their ability, which has a whole variety of effects that allow you to manipulate these cards out on the table or the cards in front of you in various ways. The first player to collect all their tiles wins the game, and if you are interested in this one, you can go ahead and check it out. I'll have it linked down below. And launch on the 3rd, we have Shape Invaders, and this one's a head-to-head dexterity game where each player is going to have a mothership as well as a bunch of fighters and a few shields that they can use to try and defend and respawn their ship. The way the game works is that players will set up their pieces on opposite ends of the table, and then they're just going to be taking turns flicking their mothership or any of their fighters towards the other player's ships. The goal here is to try and knock them out of play, which will eliminate them from the game, but if you do get the mothership out of play, it can actually respawn onto any of the shields that are still in play. So those shields not only act as obstacles out on the table, but they can also act as extra lives if you still do have any available to you. Another fun detail with this game is that the pieces are made out of a high-end acrylic, which will give them a very premium feel and make them very durable when you do flick them into the other pieces. But they are also designed to be lit up from the edges. So if you want this game to have the best table presence that it possibly can, you can go ahead and set up a few lights on the edges of your table, and that's going to be lighting up the pieces and making it look like they're actually glowing. That's pretty much everything I have for this game, so if you are interested, check it out. I will have it linked in the description down below. Also on September 3rd, we have Cyberpunk 2077, the board game, which of course is based on the video game with the same name. And this one is a cooperative game where players are going to be playing through an overarching campaign, which is going to be going through a bunch of different missions made up of a bunch of different objectives. Each player is going to be playing as their own individual character with 4 stats that are going to be helping you in a variety of different ways. The first one is your attack stat. The second one is the strength of your body, which is going to be determining your health and your movement. And then there is intelligence and then technical ability. Of course, each player does also have a health tracker as well, and these 3 slots at the top of their board where they can upgrade their character with a bunch of different cybernetic abilities and bonus actions. And the way that those work is that you can spend them on your turn in order to activate any of the icons outlined on them. But in order to get them back, you do have to get your health up to its maximum amount, and then anytime that you heal yourself after that, it's going to be refreshing one of those tiles. This is also a deck building game, and that's the main thing that makes these characters different from each other, because each of these characters is going to have their own unique starting deck, but then each of them are going to be upgraded in their own unique ways depending on the decisions and opportunities that the players make. But the way the game plays is that players are going to be setting up the board according to the mission, and they're going to be trying to complete those various mission objectives. The way that the rounds work is that there's going to be a round where players are taking their actions, and then there's going to be a cooldown phase where players can spend anything that they've gained, but then also the game itself is going to progress, which could allow additional enemies out on the board, or could give some additional activations to the enemies that are already there, or it could do something completely different like opening up new sections or progressing different efforts that either the players or the enemies are trying to achieve. But players are each going to have a hand of cards, and then players are going to be taking turns using those cards to perform their actions. This is going to allow you to move around on the board, hack various systems, open doors, damage enemies, heal your own damage, or pick up various tokens that can be spent for upgrades later. If you ever start your turn in a room with an enemy, then you're going to be rolling dice for both you and the enemy to determine what damage is done. The dice that's rolled depends on the enemy as well as which weapons you're holding. And of course, a nicer weapon means rolling more dice, which means that you have a higher chance to do more damage. But the thing that I've neglected to say so far, and the thing that makes this game very unique from a lot of other games within this genre, is that this is a real-time game, so players are going to be taking as many actions as they can, making different decisions and playing their cards, all within a timer for that round. This means that you're going to be picking up loot and even resolving that combat during this timer, so everything you do is going to be subtracting from the amount of time that you have to take your actions. Once that timer is up, you're going to be going into that cooldown phase that I mentioned before. Then you'll be able to spend any of your collected loot in order to purchase upgrades for your character or upgrade their various stats. You'll check for any completed objectives and gain the rewards, which can often grant you additional cards or other upgrades. Then you'll be adjusting the board and moving any enemies according to the mission, and the game continues like this until players either succeed or fail at that mission, moving through the campaign and discovering that overarching story. If you are interested in this one, you'll definitely want to follow along to get the Gamefound exclusive character added to your pledge completely for free, and I will have a link to this campaign in the description down below. And I almost forgot to mention that this one does have an app to facilitate the game and make it play a lot more streamlined, but it is not required if you are not a fan of apps. And also on September 3rd, we have Moon Bunny, and this one is a competitive game that has strategic elements, but then it also does incorporate tile placement and a little bit of set collection. The way this game works is that players are actually going to have two different bunnies that they'll be able to move throughout the game, but you can only ever have one bunny on the board at a time. Players are going to be moving those bunnies in order to try and collect different recipes or different herbs to fulfill those recipes in order to gain victory points for the end of the game. The way the game plays is over a series of turns, and on your turn you're going to be moving your bunny and taking whatever tile it stops on. Like I said, there are two different types of bunnies that you have, and one of them is going to be able to move any 3 spaces orthogonally, whereas the other one can move any distance but only in a single direction. Like I said, you're going to be picking up whatever tile you stop on, and then you're going to be placing it somewhere in your tableau that's going to be located above your tiles. You do have a spot on your board where you can reserve a tile if you don't want to place it right away. The recipes that you gain this way are private objectives, and they're only going to apply to you, but there are also some shared objectives that players will be playing with as well. Each of these are going to have some sort of requirement that they're going to score on, such as getting certain sets of herbs or having them adjacent to certain herbs, or even getting tiles of a particular color. Some of the tiles will also feature a mooncake icon on them, and that will allow you to gain a mooncake from the supply. And these essentially act as a currency that you can spend to either purchase these different scrolls at the top of the board here, which will grant you with all sorts of special abilities, or instead you can spend those mooncakes to swap out your bunny for the other bunny. And these are free actions that you can just do at any time on your turn. So if you do want to switch to your other bunny, you can always do that, assuming that you do have the mooncakes to pay for it. I should also mention that this is called Moon Bunny, and even though the board is flat, it does represent a moon, which is round, so if you do move to one edge of the board, you are able to cycle around to the other side with any of your additional movement. Whenever you move from a space where you took a tile, you will be replacing it with a random tile from the supply, and the game ends once either the herb stack runs out or the recipe stack is empty. And at that point, the players are going to be adding up their victory points according to any of the recipes that they're able to complete, and the player with the most victory points wins the game, and you can find a link to this campaign in the description down below. Also on the 3rd, we have a bunch of games launching in this campaign, but the real highlight here is, of course, Raw, and this is going to be offered in its deluxe edition with all those really nice goodies and upgrades. If you're not already familiar with this game, this is a really popular auction bidding game from the designer Rainer Knizia, who is just really good at creating a lot of popular games. And I guess because of that, it's not a huge surprise that this one is our Discord pick of the week, but it's also my own personal pick of the week as well. But before I jump into how exactly Raw plays, I first want to mention that this new campaign here is going to be introducing a brand new expansion called Raw Traders. It's going to be adding a brand new tile into the game as well as a few other components, but the way that this tile works is that if you're able to gain it, it will be worth a victory point. But also anytime that you gain another one of those tiles, or anytime anyone at the table gains another one of those tiles, you'll be able to add a goods token to that tile, with each of those goods tokens also being worth a victory point. The catch here is that both the tiles and the goods are going to be scored and removed from play at the end of the round, which means that these could be very valuable to invest in if a lot of them do come up in the round, but it could be a little bit of a gamble since that may not always happen that way. Of course, if you're not already familiar with the base game, this might not make a whole lot of sense just yet, so what I'll do is go ahead and roll my previous coverage of Raw explaining how the game plays if you do want to learn more about the game. But then I'll also jump back and explain the other two games here, which is Ratzia as well as Raw and Right. So if you do already know how to play Raw and you don't want to see a whole run through of how that works, you can just jump ahead to those other two games if you do want to learn about them. But if you're not familiar with how this game plays, you're essentially trying to collect different tiles in order to score victory points by collecting different sets, because all the tiles score in different ways, and you're going to be slotting those into the different areas on your personal player board in order to track the tiles that you've collected and hopefully score the most victory points at the end of 3 rounds. But I did mention that there is a lot of variety in the tiles, and not all of them help you score victory points. Instead, some can give you some special actions or abilities, while others can actually cause disasters and cause you to lose tiles. But on a player's turn, they can take one of 3 actions. They can either draw a tile from the bag and then put it in the shared display here, or instead they can use a god tile if they have one in their possession to just take a tile from the display if there's a tile out there that they really want. Or you can trigger an auction, which allows all the players to either bid or pass on everything that you can see on the shared display, including this token in the middle, which I will get to in a second. Whenever there's an auction in this game, players will each be able to put in their bids starting from the player to the left of the player who initiated the auction, and then you're going to be essentially choosing one of the available tiles from the center of your board of different values, and each player will be able to put one of those out as their bid, and the player who put out the highest value after all players have either passed or bid will get everything in the shared display. This can happen at any time, so the board may not be as full as you see it now, which means that a lot of players might pass if there's nothing there that they really want. But for the player that did win the auction, they're going to be swapping the bid token that they used to win the auction with the one that is out on display. So they're going to be taking that one that's out on display and putting it on their own personal board face down, indicating that they've used one of their tokens, and their token is now out on display, and whoever wins the next auction will get the one that they put out there. So the different bid tokens will be getting passed from player to player, so you'll always want to keep in mind that whatever you are bidding, you are potentially giving an opportunity for another player to have that in a following round, because when it comes back to your board, it goes face down, and it doesn't get flipped back up until all players' tokens are face down, and then that triggers the start of the next round, and all of those get flipped back up. Since there's so much variety in the tiles, victory points can be triggered at different points in the game depending on the tiles that you've collected, but at the end of the 3rd round, players are going to be comparing their overall victory points that they've gained to that moment, and then the player with the most victory points is going to win the game. The simplest way to describe Ratzia is that it's essentially a card version of the game Raw, and at the start of the game, each player is going to have a few different bidding cards that they'll be able to use in the various auctions throughout the game. Then there's also going to be a deck of cards that players are going to be drawing from rather than a bag of tiles. On your turn, you have 3 different options to choose from, with the first one being to, of course, draw from that deck of cards and then add whatever card that you drew onto the end of the bidding row. The bidding row is going to be below the deck of cards, and each time a player draws a card, it's going to be added to that row, increasing its size and increasing its value, unless, of course, someone draws a police card, which is then going to be forcing an auction. When an auction occurs, each player is going to have the option to submit one of their bidding cards into the auction, with a player who submits the highest value winning the auction. Then they'll be taking all those cards from the row into their supply in order to create sets, which will score them victory points at the end of the game. Then they're also going to be swapping the card that they bid with the one that's currently out on display. That one's going to come back to you face down, meaning that you won't be able to use it until a following round. One of the other actions you could perform rather than just drawing a card from the deck and adding it to the auction row is to just simply declare an auction. You might want to do this for a variety of reasons. Either there's cards there that you really want and you want to try and buy those before it gets too valuable to someone else, or maybe there's cards there that you don't want and you're hoping that other players will bid on them and reduce the amount of bidding cards that they have access to, making future auctions a little bit more in your favor. But one of the other reasons that you might want to do this is if you have any auction cards left and the round is nearly coming to an end, because once 7 police cards are drawn, that's going to be forcing the end of the round, and if you have any auction cards left, that doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to use them for any other auctions that round, and you're just instantly moving into the next round. But there is also another special card that you do want to be aware of, and those are the Thieves cards. And if you are able to acquire those by buying a row that has a Thief card in it, you can actually use an action in a future turn in order to spend that card, in order to take any other card you want from the bidding row or from another player. The game continues like this over the 3 rounds, and then the player with the most victory points at the end wins the game. And then we have Raw and Write, which is the most different of the games. And this one is, of course, going to involve writing on a sheet like most roll and writes, but this one is actually a draw and write, which means that you're actually going to be using cards in order to determine the actions that you have available, and whichever card that you choose, you're going to be taking that associated action. The deck also has 9 different raw cards in it, and anytime that 3 of those cards are drawn, that's going to be triggering the end of the round, and since there's 9 cards, there is, of course, 3 rounds in this game. This is a game that plays over a series of turns, and on your turn, you're just going to be drawing 3 cards from the deck and then revealing them out on the table. Then you're going to be choosing one of those cards to take your action with. Whichever card you choose is going to be discarded from those 3 cards, leaving just 2 for all the other players. Each player can choose which of those 2 they want to use. They don't get discarded, so multiple players can choose the same card. But essentially, each of these cards are going to allow you to fill in some area of your sheet. There are a bunch of different sections here. The top section is broken into 3 different spaces, each one representing a different round, because each of those boxes are going to be scoring at the end of that specific round. When you draw the card that allows you to use that section, it's also going to have a number associated with it, and you'll be able to put that number into one of the boxes, and the player that has the highest value whenever that scores is going to be getting the most amount of victory points. The third section works very similar to the first one, except for in this one, all the numbers do need to be in sequential order. So depending on what numbers you get at which point in the game, you're going to have to anticipate where you think you can place those so that you're not locking yourself out of placements in the future. The next 2 sections are broken into rows and columns, but they work very different from each other, and you're going to have access to this first one anytime that you activate a card with any of these symbols on them. That's going to allow you to fill in one of the spaces in that associated column, but it's up to the player to decide which space they want to fill. Each row represents the different rounds in the game, and these are going to be scoring at the end of those rounds, and the more of these that you have filled in, the more points you're going to gain. Final section works a little simpler, where you're just going to be filling in the different columns depending on which monument is on the card that you chose. And then if you're able to fill up a column, then that's going to be scoring you victory points according to that column. Or if you fill in a row, that is another way that you can gain some bonuses. But one thing that I really like about this game is that even though this version doesn't feature the bidding like the other raw games, this one does incorporate a little bit more push your luck. This is because each of the sections can also grant you with negative victory points if you're the furthest behind, or if you just didn't invest enough into that section. Since each round ends when 3 raw cards are drawn, that essentially means that you don't know the length that the round is actually going to be. Of course, once 2 are drawn, you can start anticipating that it's probably going to end pretty soon, but you're going to want to meet those minimum requirements for each round before each round ends, but it is up to you to decide how much you want to push that off. But the player with the most victory points at the end of those 3 rounds wins the game, and if you do want to check out any of these games, you can go ahead and find a link to the campaign in the description down below. Also launching on the 3rd, we have Away Team Bingo the Roll and Write, and this one is a competitive game where each player is going to have their own sheet of paper, and each sheet is going to have 3 different missions on it. Players are going to be using dice in order to send their crew out on these various missions to try and make different discoveries and make progress up various tracks in order to score victory points. Each round you're going to be choosing one of the 3 missions to go out on, and then each turn you're going to be rolling a die which is going to determine which column you're visiting in that mission. And then you're going to roll another die which is going to determine which row you're visiting. The intersection point there is going to be the location that you're going to have to resolve, and these can have all sorts of different effects, like making progress on those various tracks, gaining discoveries, or potentially losing crew members. The game does offer a bit of push your luck because once you do this, you do have the option to continue the mission by rolling more dice to visit even more locations, but you can only ever visit each location once. And if you do end up somewhere that you've already visited, then you're just going to be reducing the value of that die by 1 until you get to a location that you haven't visited. The push your luck comes into play here because as you lose your crew members, you're going to be getting negative victory points at the end of the game for each crew member that you've lost. But also, if you lose all your crew members within a mission, then you are going to be ending that mission early and losing everything that you have gained so far. Luckily, you do also have a teleporter, and you can use this up to 4 times per mission. And what this allows you to do is, rather than visiting the location that you rolled, you can instead visit any of the locations that are adjacent to it. Of course, at any point after resolving a location, you can call an end to your mission to return safely back to your ship, and that's going to be triggering the end of the round for you. And once all the players have ended their rounds, then you'll be able to move into the following mission. Once all 3 of those missions are completed, you're going to be adding up all the victory points from the discoveries and the progress up your tracks, but then also subtracting any victory points for the number of crew that you lost. But then the player with the most victory points at that point wins the game, and if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And launch on September 5th, we have Fate of the Kingdom, and this one is a competitive game where each player is going to have a hand of 7 cards at the start of the game, and then the game plays over a series of turns with the active player drawing an event from the event deck. These cards will have some flavor text on them, but they'll also have a multiplier that will increase the value of whichever card players decide to play that round if the active player decides to enact this card. The active player is going to be reading this card out to all the other players, and then everyone at the table is going to be choosing one of their cards to put face down in front of them, and then everyone's going to be simultaneously revealing their cards, and the points are going to be calculated according to the combination of the card as well as the event card. But you do want to use your cards carefully here because all the cards that were used in a round are then discarded. You might also want to keep an eye on what cards the active player still has in their possession, because that will give you some idea whether or not they want to enact this event card or not, because if they don't enact it, you're not going to be getting that multiplier. But the rounds continue like this for 7 rounds as the players are using up all their cards, and then once all those cards are used up, you're going to be taking the total final score and comparing them, and then whichever player has the highest, they're going to be able to add a character into their kingdom. The way this works is that the character you get to add is going to be the character card that you played on the final round. This means on all future rounds, you don't want your final card to be one of the characters that you've already added to your kingdom. Of course, this also does give additional information to the other players because they know which cards you don't want to keep for your final round if you already do have some of these characters already. The first player that completes their kingdom wins the game, and if you do want to check this one out, I will have it linked down below. And that's everything this week, but don't leave yet because we still do have a giveaway to announce. This one's going to be for a pledge for Lords of Heaven. And all you got to do to enter this giveaway is leave a comment down below. But if you're not familiar with this game, this is a game where the main board is going to be set up with a bunch of different locations, and players are going to be playing as different factions that are going to have a different setup at the start of the game. Players are going to be drafting a hand of cards at the start of the game, with these cards having a bunch of different uses. You can discard them in order to just gain some resources, but you can also just put them out on these different action locations at the bottom of the board, and each of these do operate a little bit differently with how they interact with the card, but then they also do grant you a different action, so there's a few things to consider here. There's a bunch of different actions, but mainly you're going to be using those actions to gain resources or spend resources in order to build buildings or deploy units or gain influence in the different regions. And each region's broken into 2 different sections. One side represents the region itself, while the other side represents the city. To really have control over a region, you want to have influence in the city, but you can also get supporters in a region in order to make controlling it a little bit easier or to help you in combat if you are contested. I personally think this game looks really well designed, and I think it's going to be a ton of fun, and I really do like those multi-use cards and the way that they work with the board, and I'm also very interested in the area control and the way that the combat works, because in this game you can also ally with other players when you are trying to overtake a region, and there are reasons why other players may or may not want to join you. And this giveaway is going to be for a deluxe edition pledge, and all you got to do to enter in on this is leave a comment down below. And you can say anything that you want, but if you are looking for something in specific, it is a long weekend here in Canada. We are celebrating Labor Day, and I think that is also celebrated in the US on the same day. So if you are in the US, I think you also have a long weekend, so I hope you enjoy it. But feel free to let us know what you plan to do with your extra day. And for everyone else in the world, if you don't have a long weekend here, maybe just let us know what you're up to this weekend if you're up to anything fun. Otherwise, like I said, you can leave any comment that you like. For myself, I'm just going to be spending the weekend working on my house. I have a lot to do, and summer is just flying by, and I want to get everything done before winter hits because that's just going to make things even more complicated. But I do like being productive and getting things done because then when I do spend time doing other fun things, I don't feel so guilty knowing that there's all this other work to do. But that's everything I have for you this week, and I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to let me know. And until next time, keep that shelf cluttered and the table full.